Hello, everybody. I am coming to you with chapter 24. As I mentioned in lecture, this is not an incredibly long chapter. Most of you will take another nutrition class in a different class or as a class later on. So this is much shorter than what's in the textbook. I wanted to hit some high points. This does follow along with your outline in the published notes. So the point of all of these nutrients that we ingest, we ingest and then digest carbohydrates and fats and proteins and vitamins and minerals. And ultimately, the point of this is that many of them are oxidized into ATP. If you look at this slide here, you see the structure of ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So you have the adenine group, you have the ribose, which is a sugar, and then you have your 3-phosphate. So in order to have the ingredients to make ATP, we're going to get those from the food that we consume. So if we're talking about measuring food energy, we're familiar with the idea of a calorie, but most of us don't realize what a calorie actually is. So we're going to talk in terms of kilocalories. That would be 1,000 regular calories. And that's the amount of energy that you need to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree centigrade. So that's kind of a strange concept, but if we think of it this way, this is how many calories it would take to do a variety of different things around your house. So 5 pounds of spaghetti has enough calories or enough energy in it to brew a pot of coffee. So if we think of calories in terms of energy, that can help us wrap our head around it a little bit better. When we're talking about nutrients, these are any substances that our body needs to promote growth, repair, normal maintenance. And the major nutrients, the things that we were ingesting, digesting, and absorbing by the digestive system, were carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. But we're also going to talk about vitamins, minerals, and water and their role in the nutrition area, or why they're so important to our body. We consider vitamins and minerals things that are only needed in very small amounts, but even though you only need a little of it, there can be a drastic effect if you don't get it at all. So some nutrients are what are considered essential. These are things that our body is not capable of making and things that we must get from the food that we eat. And you'll notice there's quite a list here: 13 vitamins, 1 carb, 1 fat, 18 minerals, 10 amino acids, 1 protein, 1 water. With those 45 different components that are on the table on this slide, your body can make anything else that it needs. So for example, if you look over at the amino acids column, there are 10 listed there. If you remember back from when you learned about how amino acids make proteins, there are 20 different amino acids that we use to make proteins. So what that means is these 10 we have to consume from our food, and then the other 10 can be made from these or some other substances in our diet. So let's talk about carbohydrates for a minute. I know there's a strange little, some drawing on that slide. That's a little bit old school, that drawing from a previous lecture. The reason I have that up there is fiber, F-I-B-E-R, is a more Americanized spelling, and F-I-B-R-E is a more European spelling. I just wanted to point that out so you didn't think I had a typo on my slide. Most of our carbohydrates are going to be derived from plant material. We get a little bit of carbohydrates from milk, but remember, humans are a bit of an oddball in that we're the only mammalian species that drinks the milk of another organism. Carbs can be divided into a couple of groups, and this is just going to depend on how many sugars are linked together to make that carbohydrate. So a monosaccharide, something like glucose, or a disaccharide, those are quite simple. It's either 1 sugar molecule or 2 sugar molecules that have been covalently bonded together. These are what we're going to find in fruit, in sugar cane, sugar beets, honey, milk, very sweet things. When you think of your more processed foods, candy and cookies, those are going to be a lot of these mono and disaccharides. Now, because they are so simple in chemical structure, not a lot of work has to go into breaking them down. So for a monosaccharide, no bonds have to be broken, and we can absorb those directly. A disaccharide, we only have to break one covalent bond in order for those to be absorbed. So these are things that can raise our blood sugar very, very quickly. So we mentioned before that, if a diabetic has really low blood sugar, we'll give them something like a piece of candy or a glucose tablet or some Coke or some orange juice, and that's because their body can absorb those sugars very, very quickly. That's true for all of us, but it could help get their blood sugar back up. Now, polysaccharides, poly means many, saccharide means sugar. These are lots and lots and lots of sugars bound together with covalent bonds. The more bonds you have, the more difficult that sugar is to break down. So there's two different kinds here. You've got starches and you've got fiber. So starches are a storage form of carbohydrates for plants. So typically you're going to find starches in your fruits and vegetables. Not all of them. Some fruits have mono and disaccharides. But things like potatoes, for example. A potato is that plant storing carbohydrates in the form of starch, and we happen to eat those. So you can see this starch is a lot of sugar molecules bound together, so it would take a little bit more work to break those down. Fiber is even more complex. So this is 3 long chains of sugars that are bound together, and then those 3 chains are bound together. So fiber is the structural carbohydrate of a plant. So we tend to find fiber in the stems or the leaves of a plant. So if you think tonight for dinner, I had a meal that had kale in it. Kale is a leafy green vegetable that had a lot of fiber in it because I was eating the leaves and the stems of the plant. So fiber is even harder for our body to break down because there are so many bonds holding it together. So different kinds of carbohydrates that we eat can be broken down more quickly, absorbed more quickly, and can affect our blood sugar differently. Now, there's a couple of reasons we use carbs in the body. The one that we've probably talked the most about or heard the most about is that we use glucose to make ATP via cellular respiration. Cellular respiration requires glucose and oxygen. But also, carbohydrates are a prime energy source for our neurons and red blood cells. And if we have extra carbohydrates in our body, those will get converted into a substance called glycogen, which gets stored in our liver or our skeletal muscles. So we do have a little bit of reserve there. If you go for a while without eating and your blood sugar starts to get a little bit low, your body can tap into that glycogen reserve to help you manage your blood sugar. A couple other ways we use carbohydrates is we have sugars in nucleic acids. If you remember DNA and RNA, the R stands for ribose, the D stands for deoxyribose. So you need sugars that come from carbohydrates in order to make DNA and RNA. We also have sugars associated with our cell membranes. Now, typically we say the minimum requirement of carbohydrates for an adult human is 100 grams a day. If an individual is consuming less than 50 grams of carbs a day, the body will revert over to using fat and then protein if fat is not available for energy. And we call this stage ketosis. So this is the premise behind, if you've heard of the ketogenic diet or the Atkins diet, lots of low carbohydrate diets are based off this premise of getting you into ketosis. If I'm eating very few carbs, my body has to go to another source of fuel. So the next source of fuel it will go to is fat. So this actually works very, very well. It's difficult because 50 grams of carbs is not very much. If you're only eating 50 grams of carbs a day, you're probably just eating some leafy green vegetables for your carbs and not much else. No bread, no pasta, no sugar, no fruit, no tomatoes. All of those things would put you over 50 grams of carbs a day. The thing a lot of people don't realize is when you pull back on your carb intake a day, it's not actually your protein intake you need to increase to balance it. It's your fat intake you increase to balance it. You can actually cause serious kidney damage to your body by consuming too much protein because as your body breaks down protein, it creates some different kinds of wastes. So when you go low carb, you often go high fat. That means a lot of things like a lot of eggs and a lot of avocado, um, some more lean meats, but you got to get that fat up somehow. It doesn't mean eating bacon all the time. Olive oil, nuts, those kinds of fatty foods. So let's look at lipids. The sources that we're going to get in our diet are going to be our triglycerides, and we can divide triglycerides into two categories, what are called saturated and unsaturated. So saturated fats are usually going to come from animal products. So if you're eating a steak and there's fat on it, that's triglyceride. Some tropical plant products, so coconut oil is a saturated fat, and then what are called hydrogenated oils. These are not naturally occurring. These are things we have manufactured in a lab to have the characteristics of a trans fat, a saturated fat. So a saturated fat is typically going to be solid at room temperature. So if you think about bacon grease or lard or butter, all of those things are solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are going to be from things like seeds and nuts, olive oil, vegetable oil, canola oil, corn oil, all that good stuff. It's liquid at room temperature. So the difference between these two is going to be whether they have double bonds associated with them or not. So in the image that you see here, we see the glycerol, and there are those three fatty acid chains that kind of make that zigzag pattern. What you're looking at here is a saturated fat. In an unsaturated fat, those tails, those fatty acid tails, would be bent because we would have some double bonds between some of our carbon molecules that are in those tails. Because they're bent, they can't stack up tightly together, and that's what causes them to be liquid at room temperature. Now, typically dietary-wise, the recommendation is going to be to eat unsaturated fats, specifically what are called monounsaturated fats. But it's really interesting. In the 90s, there was this really big push for low fat, low fat, low fat, low fat. Fat was what was causing heart disease. Fat was what was killing all these people. And a lot of new research recently has realized that fat is not as much the problem as sugar is the problem. Added sugar in processed foods can often have far more negative consequences on the body and the state of health than consuming fat does. You still have to be careful with fat consumption, but it's not quite as evil as the dietitians in the 90s would have had us to think it was. So why do we need fat? Most of us think of fat as a bad thing. It's something we want less of. Personally, I would like to have a little less of it, but we need it for a couple of reasons. We're going to see in just a second some of the vitamins that we consume are fat soluble. So they're not water soluble. They need fat for us to absorb them. So if you don't have fat in your diet, you can't absorb them. Our liver cells, our hepatocytes, and our skeletal muscle will use a lot of fat for fuel. And phospholipids are actually part of our cell membranes and the myelin that's found around our neurons. We also store fat as adipose tissue. So women have a higher body fat percentage than men do. Women tend to carry it around their hips and waist, and of course breasts are just big bags of fat basically. They're going to serve as cushion, insulation, and stored energy. And we know that women typically have higher body fat percentages than men because women are the ones bearing children, and that body fat is important during the pregnancy period. We can also use lipids to make these substances called prostaglandins. They do a lot of different things in our body. You can see the image of them here, and you can see structurally they have those tails very similar to the way a triglyceride does. These can be involved in things like telling our smooth muscle to contract, and we know we have smooth muscle in all of our hollow organs. We have it in our blood vessels. It can help maintain blood pressure because it can control vasodilation, and it can be involved in the inflammation response. So let's talk protein for a second. Most people, when you talk to them about protein in their diet, they assume that it is going to come from animal products. It's going to come from meat or eggs or milk or a variety of other dairy products. And animal sources of protein are very high quality, and the reason a lot of people prefer them is they give you the best ratio of those 10 essential amino acids. So we said there are 10 amino acids you have to get from your diet and 10 that your body can make. So when you eat animal proteins, you are almost always getting all 10 of those essential amino acids. That's what I mean by most are complete proteins. Plant sources tend to be incomplete proteins. They have some of those essential amino acids, but not all of them. And there are a couple of exceptions. Soybeans are an exception. Soy is a complete plant-based protein, so that's why you see a lot of vegetarians eating tofu or other soy-based products. You have to be really careful with soy, though. Soy can mimic estrogen, and so you have to be very careful not to consume too much soy. My mom, for example, who has had breast cancer, she's not supposed to eat soy at all. If anything, maybe she uses a little soy sauce every once in a while. But doing something like eating tofu or drinking soy milk could be really dangerous to her because it acts like estrogen, and she had a cancer that really liked estrogen. Now, there's another exception I don't have listed on this slide. There's another food called quinoa, spelled Quinoa. It's a little grain type substance. It kind of looks like couscous. You could use it anytime you were eating like rice with your meal. It's kind of nutty tasting. I eat it pretty regularly. It's pretty good, and it is a complete protein as well. Interestingly, there is a combo of two plant-based foods that together serve as a complete protein, and we see this combo of foods in almost every culture around the world, and that combination is beans and rice. So African cuisine, Central Latin American cuisine, Spanish cuisine, Indian cuisine, we see some sort of variety of rice and beans, whether it's black beans or lentils or pinto beans. Together, those two foods have all 10 of those essential amino acids. And if you think about it, those are things you don't need refrigeration for. They're relatively easy to cook. You can serve a lot of people with them. If you plan to go to graduate school, develop a taste for rice and beans because you'll eat a lot of them because they're not expensive. So what do we use protein for? Some structural things. The keratin in your skin, if you remember the upper surface of your skin, that stratum corneum is made of dead cells that have keratin surrounding them. You have collagen and elastin in your connective tissues. That is made of protein, as well as your muscles. So that's really the big one. Myosin and actin in your muscle are proteins. The way our body has the amino acids it needs to build all this stuff is because you consume protein, your body dismantles it and absorbs the amino acids. Now, we also need proteins in order to make enzymes. So all of the enzymes in your body. So we've talked a lot about the enzyme carbonic anhydrase lately. Enzymes are proteins. They're made of amino acids. So in order to build that protein, your body is using the amino acids from the food you ate. We have a lot of hormones that are also made of protein. Same deal. You eat food, you eat protein, your body breaks it apart, absorbs the amino acids, and it can use those building blocks to make any of these different things in your body. Now, an amino acid that is absorbed by your digestive system can be used two ways. Our body can either use it to make new stuff, so make that keratin or that collagen or those hormones or those enzymes, or it can burn that amino acid for fuel. That is an option as well. Which one it decides to do depends on three different things. So one of the things is what's called the all or none rule. Say we want to build a protein that takes 100 specific amino acids to do it, right? I need 10, threonines, and I need 10 asparagines, and I need 6 thymines, whatever the recipe is to make that protein, and you are one amino acid short. If you do not have all of the components to make that protein, your body will not make it, because we know that a protein structure, how it folds up, is completely dependent on having the right sequence of amino acids. So your body is not going to build a wrong protein on purpose. It does it occasionally by accident, but on purpose, your body's not going to do that. So if you don't have all 100 amino acids, those 99 that you do have are going to get burned up or oxidized for energy. The other thing that's considered is how adequate is your calorie intake. So your body's first choice for energy is always going to be carbohydrates. If you don't have enough carbohydrates, say you're on a low carb diet, your body is going to revert to fat next. If your body does not have enough fat to burn, then your body would revert to breaking down protein. Now, again, you're starting to get into some dangerous territory here. This can severely damage your kidneys, and you would be in because think about it, if you have no excess fat in your body to burn and your body's having to revert to breaking down proteins, like breaking down muscle, you're in a really bad place nutritionally. You're probably starving. We're talking, think of pictures you have seen of people who are starving to death, like from the Holocaust or from the famines in Ethiopia. Very sunken cheeks, very low muscle mass. You're in a real bad place if your body has gotten to the point that it's breaking down proteins for energy. And the other thing is your body's always trying to maintain nitrogen balance. So our amino acids are going to contain nitrogen in them, and your body's always trying to balance out the rate at which it is synthesizing or making new proteins with the rate at which old proteins are being broken down, right? Because think about it, proteins are getting broken down all the time. Your body's breaking up hemoglobin all the time. So it's trying to balance making new with tearing down old. Your body's trying to keep the same amount of protein going on in the body, relatively. So what can happen is if our balance gets skewed this way, right? You have a whole lot of protein being incorporated into the tissue. So that side of the seesaw is broken down. And way less protein being broken down and used for energy. We actually see this at a couple of periods in the lifespan. So during periods of very rapid growth, we would see this. So during growth spurts in childhood, during puberty, and during pregnancy, your body is going to be making way more proteins and incorporating it into the tissue because you are physically getting bigger than it is breaking that protein down and using it for energy. Think about when you went through a growth spurt and how much you were just starving all the time and you were eating and eating and eating and eating. That's because your body was having to make you bigger. So in order for you to grow, you're having to incorporate more proteins into your tissues. Your muscles are getting bigger. Your skin is getting bigger. Your bones are getting longer. So your body is incorporating. So this is positive nitrogen balance. You're incorporating more proteins than you are breaking them down or using them for energy. Now, the opposite situation, this would be when you're incorporating very, very little protein into tissue and you're breaking down a ton of protein to use it for energy. So your body is actually breaking down things like your muscle and your skin in order to get proteins to use. And this situation would be in a case of extreme starvation. When your body, you don't have enough calories coming in, your body has used all that extra fat you have stored in your body, and now it's gotten to the point of breaking down protein. We would call this negative nitrogen balance. So hormones are what are controlling what's happening with these amino acids. So we have hormones in our body called anabolic hormones, and when those hormones rise, those are going to tell your body, hey, we need to make more hormones because the body is getting bigger. So you've probably heard the term anabolic steroids before. So that is a case where people are injecting some substances to try and get a similar effect to what these hormones are doing naturally. So this would include things like your pituitary growth hormone, your sex hormones, so like testosterone and estrogen, as well as some hormones called glucocorticoids. All of these trigger growth in the body. We see them peak during childhood. We see them peak during puberty as well. So let's talk about the difference between vitamins and minerals. We said these are things we need in much lower amounts, but there's a difference between them. Vitamins are organic substances. They are going to come directly from your food. So remember, an organic substance is something that contains carbon. Whereas minerals are inorganic substances and they come from the earth. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't go scoop up a bowl of rocks and dirt to eat for breakfast. So you're still getting minerals from your food because plants grown in the dirt take those minerals up into the plant. So you either get it from the plant material you eat, or some animal like a cow or a pig or whatever kind of meat you like to eat has eaten that plant material, and those minerals have been transferred into the vitamins in really, really small amounts. You don't use them for energy, you don't make anything out of them, but what they do is they assist other stuff. And usually the way they're assisting is they're acting as something called a coenzyme. And what that means is a lot of vitamins and minerals are necessary for an enzyme to function correctly. So the enzyme itself is made of amino acids. It's a protein, but it just needs this other thing to help it function correctly. So most of these are not made in the body. There are a couple that are synthesized in the large intestine, but for the most part, your vitamins are things that you're having to get from eating plant material. So if you'll notice, one thing I like to point out is how colorful this image is. If you've ever heard that phrase, eat your colors, right? Eat foods that are a variety of different colors. That usually indicates that they have high concentrations of different vitamins. So orange foods, carrots and oranges have a lot of vitamin A. So always eating, just because you eat your vegetables, if you don't eat a diversity of foods, that could mean that you become deficient in a certain vitamin. So we can divvy vitamins up into two groups. Sorry, a gigantic truck just drove past my house. Two groups, water-soluble vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins. So the big difference here is just going to be how they are absorbed and whether they hang around or not. So water-soluble vitamins obviously get absorbed with water. These are going to include our vitamin B group. That's a pretty big group. They usually have numbers, B12, B6, very large group, as well as vitamin C. So you may hear it referred to as the B complex. You can buy vitamins over the counter that are advertised as the B complex. Now, because these are water soluble, we do not store these in our body, and you typically excrete them in your urine after about an hour if your body doesn't use them. So here's one of my other soapbox things. Most people do not need an over-the-counter multivitamin. And the reason for that is most of us are not deficient in those vitamins. We can very easily get the vitamins and minerals we need by eating a diverse variety of foods. And with a lot of these things, you excrete them out of the body very, very quickly. So at best, taking an over-the-counter multivitamin is creating really expensive urine. Now, because they're water-soluble and you urinate them out, there's not really a concern about overdose, right? You're not going to OD on vitamin C if you're loading up on it. But with our fat-soluble vitamins, these are vitamins A, E, D, and K. These attach to the fat in your food, and then they're absorbed with that fat in the small intestine. So all of these can be stored in your fat except for vitamin K. And because they can be stored, they can be toxic. So you can accumulate them over time, especially vitamin A. So these are ones you actually could overdose on vitamin A because you could accumulate a high level in your body. Now, that doesn't mean that a vitamin supplement cannot be beneficial to you if you are deficient in something. I'm deficient in vitamin D. I take a vitamin D supplement, but I don't take a very broad vitamin supplement because I'm not deficient in the other things. So it's important to remember that for any element in our diet, there is an optimal level of that. That's there in the purple. And if we have lower than that amount, we are deficient. So in my case, I am vitamin D deficient. And that means that whatever that vitamin that you are deficient in, or that mineral, or whatever the other substance is, that your body is not going to perform optimally because it doesn't have enough of something that it needs. Now, ultimately, if you got way too deficient in something, it could lead to death. Now, this figure shows the potential for too much of an element in the diet could be toxic. Now, we know with the B complex vitamins and vitamin C that is not really a concern because you excrete it so readily. But with something like vitamin A, an excess of vitamin A, you could see a toxic effect where the function of your body is harmed and ultimately could lead to death. So minerals, again, we mentioned this comes from the earth, so you're typically getting these from plants that absorb those minerals through the roots, and you get it from eating the plant directly, or you get it from eating fruits, or you get it from eating an animal that has eaten those plant material. So these are the things that the body requires the most of: calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium, and you need very, very small amounts of about 12 others. Now, just because you only need small amounts does not mean they're not important, and a deficiency of them can be really, really detrimental. So, pretty similar to the way vitamins were, you don't use a mineral for fuel. They do work with other nutrients, but typically these are things incorporated into structures for strength. So things like calcium and magnesium, those are really critical to bones. We see several of these ionized into body fluids, so sodium and potassium, calcium, chlorine. Those are critical for neuron function, for muscle contraction. And we have to balance the in and out of these. Our body is working really hard to try and, if we take in a lot of one of these things, it will try and excrete some to keep the balance. If we're not bringing in as much, it will try and hold on to some in order to maintain that balance. We're going to see a lot of this when we get to the chapter on the kidneys, when we're talking about how our body deals with sodium in particular. So when we're talking about metabolism, what we mean is all the chemical reactions that are happening in the body, not just cellular respiration, all those things that happen to keep you alive. So when we say, oh, she has a fast metabolism, that's just because it sounds better than saying, hey girl, you got fast chemical reactions. So reactions can fall into two categories. We have reactions that are anabolic. Those are where we build. And then catabolic reactions are where we're tearing down. So we're actually doing both of those things through our digestive system and then the processes that follow. So if you look at this image here, on the left you see there's the food molecules, and those go through these catabolic pathways. So we are going to break apart a protein into individual amino acids. We are going to break apart starch into individual sugars. We're going to break apart fats into the individual components. So those would be catabolic reactions, the breaking apart of those things. And then some of them are used as energy, but then we reassemble some of them into a new protein or a new sugar or a new fat to use somewhere in the body, and those are the anabolic pathways. So remember, when we're talking about processing energy, it all starts with the food that we absorb. So in our digestive tract, we have ingested and then digested and then absorbed nutrients in the intestines that get transported via the blood to different cells in our body. So once those nutrients get to their destination, to these tissues, they can be built into new things. They can be built into new lipids, into new proteins, into new carbs by anabolic reactions, or they can be further broken down by catabolic reactions. And this second bullet is really going to lead us to talking about cellular respiration. So while glucose seems like it is in its most simple form, believe it or not, glucose can be broken down even further into these substances called pyruvic acid and acetyl-CoA. Those substances are what go into the mitochondria to make ATP. So cellular respiration is an almost entirely catabolic process where we are breaking things apart. And remember, it requires oxygen. It is an aerobic process. This is ultimately, if you really want to get down to it, where the breakdown of your food is completed. So for my dinner tonight, right, I mentioned I had some kale and I had some rice and I had some fish. So that rice and that kale is carbohydrates. And right now, my body is digesting that down into glucose. And that glucose makes its way to my cells where it gets converted into that acetyl-CoA, which goes into my mitochondria and goes through this cellular respiration process. Now, ultimately, what will be produced is a large amount of ATP. ATP, we know, is the energy currency that our body uses to do everything. We need ATP to run the sodium-potassium pump. We need ATP to allow our muscles to contract and our neurons to fire. As a result of this process, we also produce a lot of carbon dioxide, and water is waste. Remember, ultimately, that CO2 moves back into the blood, gets taken to the lungs, and you expire it during respiration. So if you look at this last slide here, this big image that says cellular respiration, you don't have to know all the steps to this. You'll learn them all eventually at some point. But what I want you to notice is that glycolysis stage, that glucose to pyruvic acid step, that's happening in the cell. So that is glucose from the food you ate, undergoes this chemical conversion, and then that pyruvic acid moves into the mitochondria to complete the last two steps. So cellular respiration has 3 steps. The first one is glycolysis. It happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Then we have the Krebs cycle that's happening inside the mitochondria. And then the electron transport chain is also happening in the mitochondria. Now you'll notice that all 3 steps say that they produce ATP, and that's true, but it's that last step, the electron chain, transport chain, and oxidative phosphorylation that produce the bulk of the ATP. So every single cell in your body, with the exception of erythrocytes, contains mitochondria that are doing this process all the time. So constantly, your body is going through this process. So think about it. If you don't eat for a while, your body's going to start to tap into that stored glucose in your liver and your muscles to make this process happen, because we need a continual supply of ATP in order for our body to continue to function. We cannot store ATP. So while we can store oxygen on hemoglobin and myoglobin, and we can store glucose in our skeletal muscle and our liver, we cannot store ATP. So at best, at any given time, you have enough ATP to keep your body running for just a couple seconds before it has to start making more. So that's why oxygen, a constant supply of oxygen, is so critical, but also the ability to get the raw materials, the glucose, in order to do this process is so important. So that is the end of this chapter. I told you it was going to be a short one. You need to go on to Top Hat. There are some questions assigned as homework that are all associated with this nutrition chapter. Just keep in mind that we only have 1 lecture this week. So if you're in the Monday-Wednesday class, we do not meet Wednesday. If you're in the Tuesday-Thursday class, you do not meet Thursday. So this lecture will kind of fill in the gap for us not having class this week. See you next week.